Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me this episode. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told. And here's my question for today. What is possible? Maybe sounds like a simple question, but maybe one that we also take for granted, because how often are we asking ourselves, what's possible? How often is the lens that we're using one of possibility and hope and imagination and creativity? Maybe not as often as it should be. This question's on my mind today as we enter into part one of this conversation with Romi. Romi has been an executive coach, a strategic change consultant, and done so many other things that we're going to get to hear more about today. She's got incredible perspective on what it means to work towards better social worlds and how we can think differently about our present and how those better social worlds that we hope to have in the future, what it looks like to be making those right now. So without further ado, let's begin with Romi. Hi, Romi. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today. I am really looking forward to talking with you.
Hi, Abby. Well, I'm very honored that you asked me to do this. Thank you.
I am honored to get to hear some of your story today and learn a little bit more about you, and hopefully hear some wisdom that you can bring to all of us. To start, I would love to know a little bit more about you. So can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, my name is Romi Boucher, Dr. Romi Boucher. I'm thrilled to say that I finished my dissertation when I was 64 years old. And not many people can say that.
Yeah.
If you are taking an academic track in your career, 64 is very late. And, it's not something that you aspire to, or a lot of people aspire to at that point in life, because it's a lot of work to do it. But my career primarily has been as an organizational change consultant, specifically a transformational organizational change consultant. And I worked in Fortune 10 corporations from 1995 until I would say just about a couple years ago, working with leaders who want to actually reinvent their organization so that it can perform and fulfill not just the financial expectations of the corporation or the mission of the corporation or the customer demands of the corporation, but also the employees' hopes, dreams, and creativity, I would say.
Yeah.
And each of the engagements that I worked with in all these corporations would typically last between 2 to 3 years. Unlike most consultants, organizational consultants, I didn't design my practice so that I would keep getting asked back. I designed my practice so that when they had all their sea legs in terms of new practices, new ways to look at things, new ways to talk about things, a shared different vocabulary than sometimes other people had, they could generate ongoingly from there. Yeah. And one of my most favorite stories is about, I was working with the tax organization of Lucent Technologies in New Jersey. And first I worked with the leadership team, and they created a strategic intent, which is what we called it then, and different, I would say, strategic goals or pathways that would really revolutionize how tax was considered in the whole corporation. So in telephony at that time, Lucent was at the top of the heap. Their biggest competitor was Ericsson, and nationally, US nationally and internationally, things were just popping all over the place in terms of the systems. It was becoming deregulated, which of course would cause a lot of churn and upset. If you're used to working in a regulated industry, the stability of that, the pace of that is very different than if you're not working in a regulated industry. Suddenly you have to meet the expectations of Wall Street every quarter. That's a whole different reality and a context that had to be met. Plus the fact Lucent was the spinoff of AT&T. So they were very hungry to establish themselves in the mid-90s on and into the late 90s and the 2000s. So in that engagement, a lot was on the line. And I worked first with the leadership team, which was about 12 men and a woman, just one woman.
Yeah.
And they invented a strategic vision and a strategic goals that if they accomplished all those at once would absolutely add a minimum of, and it turned out they did accomplish all those goals at once within a 3-year time frame, but established and added 10 basis points to the stock price, which was unheard of. Because most of the times, tax organizations are considered at the end of the process and not important to consider strategically. But that makes no sense if you're looking at all of your resources. I mean, personally, a couple, a small organization, a large organization, you always have to be in assessing what are your resources and how are you going to keep managing all of your resources.
Yeah, right.
So, and tax advice is pretty important for all of that. Okay, so long story short, there was this one guy who worked in the compliance section of the organization, which meant that he was responsible for filing the federal tax return. And he contacted me 10 years after the engagement, 10 years after the engagement. So this was we finished the engagement in 1997, I think. He contacted me 10 years later and said that if he hadn't had all of the education, all of the coaching, the development, the inquiry into what does it take to really accomplish something impossible together with his colleagues and form new ways to collaborate and form new ways to be innovative and form new ways to partner, he never would have made it in his personal marriage, nor even at work.
Wow.
Because Lucent then went through a breakup and so forth. It got taken over. So that's my point. My work has been to help people in the workplace and anyone really to discover and delight in what really makes a difference in their life. So in their life, contextually at work, it's about their work life, correct? But do you really leave part of yourself in the parking lot and say, I'm not going to pay attention to you, whatever it is, concerned because this is work and I can't? No, you've got to sometimes address the whole person.
Yeah.
And then I worked with several other tax organizations. It turned out people kept referring me in the tax world. And it's so strange because you would think, well, all of these highly logical, very driven, super ambitious, highly respected intellects in the tax and financial world, why do you need this? The engagements I was offering, a strategic reinvention is what I called it. And the answer is that we can't get the people ignited and engaged enough, and we need help. We don't know how to do that. In Prudential, which was another organization we worked in, we did things that were so innovative and so great. One of the things we did is I borrowed Marshall Goldsmith's concept of a coaching circle. And a coaching circle is where the research on coaching is this. People don't change because of a coach. They change because the level of either discomfort or attraction or something that they want gets more powerful than the current reality. But who do they answer to? They answer to their colleagues and their superiors usually, or their managers, but a lot is their peers. And one of the things that people do all the time is that I won't call you on your baloney if you don't call me on mine, right? That's kind of like a operating unwritten rule.
Yeah.
Right? It's like a 10 commandment, usually, of what thou shalt not do in an organization. That's kind of a general one. Well, every organization has its own culture and they have their own 10 commandments, unwritten rules that are things that are understood, but not usually spoken in the foreground. So you go and get a job in any company, here's your job, here's your list of accountabilities, here's who you report to, here's who you have to interface with. But how do you really learn how to operate in the company? In the lunchroom, around the water cooler, even on Zoom in the last few years with the pandemic? Can I have a separate conversation with you offline, off this group call, right? To find out how it really works.
Yeah, right.
So in that company, in Prudential, there were, of course, it's insurance lines, financial products, all kinds of things. Well, one of the tax attorneys set up a coaching circle, and he deliberately asked the other partners that he interfaced with throughout the finance area, who actually and the actual business areas, to be in his coaching circle and to give him straight feedback about what worked and what didn't work, about how he and the tax organization interacted with their business or their responsibility functional area. And they did. He asked 6 people and they gave him direct feedback. Then he asked the question, and this was out of the coaching I had given him, what's possible? What do you really want to have happen in your company or in your area or whatever, with your customers or whatever, that isn't happening now that would be extraordinary, that we could somehow do? The coaching circle suddenly became a cauldron for innovation. They ended up inventing a new financial product that actually captured something like 5 million in the second year that it was launched. So what I want to say is, it's the kind of connectivity, the kind of attention being paid to what is said and what isn't said, the kind of sensitivity to what contexts people come to a conversation from and use in it, the sensitivity to understanding that sometimes maybe a previous interaction wasn't complete and it needs to be complete because now all of a sudden they're hearing a whole big new gossip chain throughout the company about some person or some idea. All those things really make a difference. Anyway, my career as a corporate transformational change consultant using a strategic reinvention approach lasted until about 2013, something like that, 2012. And then I really spent 2 years just working on my dissertation.
Yes.
And since I've still done that strategic reinvention work, but I've done it since, and specifically in Pfizer. But I now am mostly focusing on executive coaching. And in my executive coaching, I am much more aware of the difficulty people have in making transitions between their work life and their personal life, the overwhelming takeover of their professional life into their personal life, and how to get more, I'm going to call it full-hearted, open-hearted, full-throated commitment living. And in all of their commitments, not just their work commitments. and still not sacrificing any excellence or any
Yeah, right.
outstanding performance. So anyway, that's what I do now. And I use the Enneagram for that in some ways, along with all the other knowledge I've got.
Yeah.
Because I have a marriage and family therapy
Mm,
degree in family
mm,
systems. Even though I never got my license as a practitioner, a therapist practitioner, I did do 1,500 hours of actual delivery of
mm.
therapy, and I know the difference between coaching and therapy, so I can make those calls when it's needed
Yeah.
to refer out or to continue coaching. So that's what I do now.
I'm just feeling that, wow, I was really excited to talk to you before we got on this call. And now I'm even more excited. Because kind of here's what I'm seeing is that knowing that we're going to talk about, what's the idea of a better social world for you and from your perspective is that question does have a lot to do with change and asking kind of those CMM-ish questions of what are we making and what are we going to make and what do we want to make and how do we get there? Like it's all about change, and you've seen a lot of change and you've directed a lot of change and seen successful change, I guess. And I think maybe there's many, many people who don't have that kind of access to change like you've had. And so I think that'll probably give you I don't know, or not to put words in your mouth, but maybe a hopeful perspective on it, that you know what it takes maybe, and know that it's something that we can do. Maybe a lot of people in their own lives, relationships, work situations are feeling stuck. They're not in the kind of companies that would reach out to a consultant like you. They're not in the kind of relationships that would do that, meta communicating or trying to understand what's going on. And so I'm interested from your, kind of transformational change perspective, how you'll approach, the conversation of what our better social world looks like.
Well, a better social world. So there's a continuum of, I'm going to call it change, right?
Mm-hmm.
From fixing a problem all the way to transforming the system or the environment, which doesn't have the environment, meaning a social environment. And you
Mm-hmm.
can just pick your descriptor or your adjective about in front of environment. There is a continuum of change. And one of the big lies is that we don't change.
Yeah.
I even have an incredibly great friend who thinks that she thinks, oh, we don't fundamentally change over a lifetime. And I think to myself, absolutely not. We absolutely change
I
all the
agree. Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And because human beings are always growing and developing and adapting and shifting in with their environments, with the situations, internally as well as externally. For instance, so I'm 72 now. In my late 60s, I didn't have the same kinds of concerns that I have now. In my mid 60s, I definitely didn't have the same concerns as I even did back to my late 60s or even to 72. So people's concerns are always shifting.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do with what? How much future they have in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, a big issue or a big, um, yes, an issue. A big issue in the working world is people in what is the time horizon that are they mostly operating out of?
Mm.
And it's getting shorter and shorter. It's not like when I first started in my career, people were comfortable thinking about 5 years out, even 10 years out.
Yeah.
Not anymore.
Interesting.
They think 3 years at the most. How about a year? How about just 6 months?
Why is that?
Why? Lots of reasons. One is the financial pressure is on every quarter,
Ah.
right? And accountability of Wall Street, right? Are you going to hit your numbers? Are you going to provide return on investment at the level that you're expected to every
Mm-hmm.
quarter? So those pressures, plus When I first started, email had first started.
Yes.
And now, of course, it's like instant, instant, instant.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another, I think, big influencer on the shifting of time perspectives. So those are a couple of my thoughts about that.
And that's why I like to ask the question of, what's your idea of a better social world? How would you define it? Because I know we can't take for granted that everyone would agree on what a better social world looks like. And again, it's a question that could be answered many ways, but one of the ways I like to think about it is, not necessarily to say, oh, well, this would have happened or these people would treat each other this way. Peace and justice, I think, are absolutely part of my understanding of a better social world, better communication practices and whatnot. But I kind of like the answer of, which is what I think I'm hearing you say a little bit, but let me know if I'm putting words in your mouth, of that a better social world is one where we are guided by a better social world in a way, if that makes sense, of like,
yes,
a better social world is
yes,
trying to create a better social world, that in the trying, that's what creates the better social world if we're driven by that desire for change and growth.
it's more than that. It's the practicing of the better social world in the present.
Yeah. Yes.
It's
Right.
the practicing of the better social world in the present. So being very aware and awake to what works and what doesn't work about what you're doing. What are the implications and what are the consequences of every action and non-action you take? Plus, how others are taking or not taking, and then how being helpful. And I don't mean like fixing them. I mean, by being in communication about someone does something and it hurts you or it bothers you. Let's just say they talk too loud in their cubicle, or they send emails at 11 o'clock at night. We don't take the time to say to that person, I know you'd like to get a lot done, and the time you've got after the kids go to bed is your time and it's your quiet time. So you can probably write and think and send the emails that you wanted to send all day. But I want, not even a but, because that cancels out the first aspect.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to consider that when I get that email in the middle of the night, and if I see it, it's then disturbed my sleep. I feel like I need to get up and start working. Mm-hmm. And that might not be your intention, or maybe it is. Could you clarify that? Was that your intention when you sent it? We don't even ask that question. We don't let people know how they impact us. We don't even say, oh, do you know that this is having that impact? Could you put the email on send at 6?
Yeah.
We all have.
Yeah, right.
We all
you can do that now.
At 6 a.m. in the morning. That would make a huge difference, because then I get it first thing. Plus the fact you've had your ability to have the best time that you can generate things in a quiet time. And then I can take the ball and run with it. So that's kind of what I mean. So in the moment, all we've got is present time.
Yeah. Yeah.
We do have a memory of the past. Can we change what happened in the past? No, we can't. It happened. We can change how we interpret the past.
Yeah, right.
We can change what action or what force we use from the past. Do we have a future? No. A future is a construction in language. Right?
Yeah.
But we act as if this is something we do so automatically. We act as if our future is going to be the same as our past, not even our present, our past. Because how we think about ourselves or our company or our relationship. My relationship is the same today as it was yesterday. No, it's not. No, it's not. You have no idea who you woke. I mean, you do and you don't, right?
Yes, right.
So that's the point, is that a better social world is where we're aware of the constant, ongoing, unfolding nature of that we're always creating a social world. Period. We're either creating it as we want to live into that future, or we're creating it in a way that makes it uncomfortable to live in that future. Period. We're always creating the future we want with every single comment, orientation, interpretation, response, or reaction. Mm-hmm. And I say response deliberately because it's the root word of responsibility. Response is different from a reaction. Way different. Responsibility is aware of the implications of what you're creating. It's not like a moral, good, bad, right, wrong, all that. It's response.
Yeah.
Response. It's thoughtful. It's respectful. It's honoring. It builds trust or it does not. Hmm. A better social world is one in which we are building more trust.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Between and amongst and for each other and for ourselves, not leaving ourselves out either.
I really appreciate you drawing the attention to kind of our relationship to time in that way, where it is when I say what's a better social world, it could feel like, oh, one day down the line, I really hope things are like this, but we're making, the future is right now. We're making right now is what I think I'm hearing you say. And I, appreciate that.
And look at the future you're making with this podcast.
Well, trying to, just bring out the stories. You're making
a very exciting future with that.
Yeah.
And very open to learn and to probe into and to develop ideas and possibilities. Yes. Yeah.
It feels very vulnerable for me. I like to know things. And so I've kind of been working on putting myself in a position to kind of humble myself and just try to learn and ask more questions than, offer answers that I think I have. One thing that I want to draw back to of what you said, because it's been on my mind lately, is, talking about the practice of what are we doing? What is our practice in our present? That's kind of what's creating our future. And I've been really thinking about dialogue lately, because I've been making some infographics for the CMM Institute, and I just made one about dialogue, and I was pulling some language from the Cosmopolis website, and the language that was used on there is that being in dialogue is being in the tension between holding your ground and being profoundly open to the other. And that's what I hear when you're talking about that example of, hey, you send your email at 11 p.m. and I understand, I'm open to how that works for you. And also I need to hold my ground and say, it does not work for me. And that both of those can exist. And so to me, and like you're saying at the end, it's not a black and white, it's not a right and wrong. It's not simple like that. I feel like I grew up maybe naively thinking that the world was very simple. I didn't have a lot of big conversations about big topics, and I wasn't taught to really live in that tension, live in that complexity. And so that's something that's come really since I've been in college. I kind of specifically seek that out and crave that. It's really beautiful to me, this kind of what I call a both and of that so many things can exist and be true at the same time. And it's hard. And so it is a practice to me. And I remember, sitting in a communication class, hearing about conflict styles, and that it was such a big idea to me that they didn't stop at compromise, that the, kind of chart they were showing us is a lot of people think compromise is kind of what we're aiming for, but really beyond that, there's this other layer of collaboration. And that's what, we're really working for. We want to be working towards. And to me, that's the kind of version of showing up to each other that is about respect, that is about trust for ourselves and each other. And so that's really powerful to me.
It's very powerful to live it. And it's incredibly fulfilling to live it. One of the best teams I ever saw was in Ireland, a Pfizer Ireland tax operations team. And they had a bank of phones that they sat, they didn't have partitions or anything. And if they would overhear a colleague 3 seats away say, "Oh, you need something about the VAT tax in Germany on da 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 da," somebody else would get up, go get the paper, and hand it to them so that they had the information right there for their colleague in another part of the company. And that happened all the time. So this kind of coordination in action, coordinated action, right? As well as the collaborative mindset to be aware that it's not just me in my little bubble, it's us all the time are making something together. And what are you making? What am I making? What are we making? Not just in a dyad, but in a collective. And that's getting that across and actually having people develop practices that make that stronger is so satisfying. And so sometimes it's difficult, but a lot of times it's not as difficult. The difficulty is in the imagining, because we're so much in a didactic, a dualistic mindset versus a whole mindset, a oneness mindset. And it's erasing the dualism that is tough.
I see it as, like you're saying, it's not, once you have the tools kind of in the resources and the language to live in dialogue and practice dialogue and whatnot, and be making that better social world, it isn't that hard. You're right. I think the perception is that that's hard. Like you're talking about, in a lot of ways, the kind of change that I hope for our world feels like structural, tear it down and start all over change, which you've said is some of the kind of change that you've experienced in different organizations. And I think that's maybe what makes people perceive it as being so challenging and feeling like, I don't know where to start, because it's such a big change that's needed.
A lot of times people would ask me for that, right? And I'd say, I don't do that. That's not where I don't do that. I don't do structural change. I do inside out transformation of the people and how they relate to the company and how the company is going to relate with them, how they're going to relate to their customers, and how they're going to proliferate that, and how that they're going to make that an ongoing sustainable practice.
Right.
And then that changes the structure.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
But I don't go at things from a structural point of view, usually very much at all. I go at, let's see what the relationship is between the people and their function and their company purpose and who's their customer? Who are they out to serve? Everyone's out to serve somebody. And how are they thought of? What's their identity?
That's big. Cool. Well, I was looking around on your website and, immediately recognized the questions that you're asking of what are we making and how are we making it as being CMM-ish questions. And I just want to know from your perspective, what's useful about asking those questions? What do you feel like we get out of asking those questions of ourselves, of our relationships, of our workplaces?
Well, the first thing is that people get an awareness that they're actually making something.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, right?
And they're not aware of that usually. It's like, oh, I'm just doing what everyone else does. Right? I mean, the social proof, most people will follow what everyone else does because it's easiest. And it's not easy because people are lazy. It's easy because it takes something to think for oneself. And also to think with other people, it takes something.
Yeah.
So I think that's useful. Number one is to get aware of that we're actually making something. The second thing, what are we making, of course, has people look and see out there in real life. Oh, When I am upset and worried about doing it right, I actually add more stress to the team than I want to. Oh, I didn't realize I was making that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then how are we making it? Well, then that goes to, oh, when I interrupt, when Susan and so are talking together, that doesn't help get us streamlined like I want.
It's just striking me for you to say that, the very first thing is to help people realize that they're making something, which is not to be taken for granted, because a lot of people aren't seeing their life in terms of what they're making, or even seeing themselves as active participants, and, looking at those patterns and those chains of how their choices affect the next turn and the next turn and the next turn, and what previous choices have affected them. And I think that's just such important perspective to zoom out a little bit, right? And ask that question.
Yeah, and you said the key word, choices.
Mm-hmm.
When people go work in a large company, they are, the thing that gets forgotten is that they chose to be there.
Yeah.
And I chose to do this job. But entering a large corporation there's lots of other things that you're choosing. The culture, the trajectory of the company, and that you have an influence on it.
Mm-hmm.
You have a choice. And people forget that they have a choice in lots of things. Their relationship to authority, they have a lot of choice about that. They have choice not just in their own time and how they do things, but they have a choice in how their attitude. And mostly people forget that they have a choice about their attitude.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And again, like I was kind of alluding to and saying, that when some of the change that needs to happen in our relationships, in our cultures, in our organizations feels really daunting, I think that's the freeze, that makes people choose inaction.
Yes.
And so again, it's that first step of, well, you have choices, and then also breaking it down to say the choices you make right in this second, that's what's creating the culture. That's what's creating the larger system. It's the patterns and the ways that we interact with each other and the ways we collaborate or don't collaborate with each other that are creating the larger system. And that's what I like to think about when I've talked to a couple other people that maybe do similar work to you in terms of organizational change and consulting, and that, or I think about that, I studied interpersonal communication, but one of the other options was organizational communication. And, you had to take different classes and whatnot, but what is an organization if not just a bunch of human beings, trying to work together in a system? So really it's the same when you can break it down to say, yes, we're all, trying to work and coexist in this social world of an organization, of a society. But really we're just a bunch of human beings, and we have choices about how we show up to each other. And so let's be conscious about those choices.
Yes.
Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Romi, but we will be back next week for part 2, so you can join us then. In the meantime, I would suggest reflecting on the question that I posed at the top of the episode, which you can also find in the show notes, and that is, what is possible? And also, what else becomes possible when we start to ask ourselves this question? Again, this is about what changes and what can change when we start to show up differently and when we start to see ourselves as active participants. So that's the reflection I hope that you can do this week between now and part 2 of this conversation. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is one of many initiatives designed to move us closer toward that better social world. And as Romi talked about, this is just one of many initiatives that is actively making those better social worlds in the present, or at least that is the hope and the goal with this work. As far as podcast next turns, share this episode, invite someone into the conversation, and another way to stay connected and keep the dialogue alive is to reach out to me. I love to hear from you. You can connect with me through email, through the website, or through commenting on YouTube and Instagram. And you can find the links to all of those places in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.